So the idea for this talk started off, started off with something that was going to be very informal. It seemed like there might be more interest, so I turned this into something a little bit more formal. I'm happy to do whatever you all would find most interesting. What I did, I put together some slides. I thought in order to answer the question of what's next for greenhouse gases in the Clean Air Act, I would first talk about how we got to where we are with the Clean Air Act. So some Clean Air Act basics for non-lawyers. This does not take the place of taking Jim Solomon's excellent environmental law class for those of you who really want to go deeper on this, but understanding the basics I think is important because the EPA's authority to act and to regulate greenhouse gas emissions is directly linked to what the Clean Air Act says the EPA can do. So going through the process of decisions that the EPA has made, decisions the courts have made that have gotten us to the point where the EPA is regulating greenhouse gases, and the choices the EPA has made that have gotten us to where we are today. I think it's an important part of the story, so I'll probably spend about half my time talking about that, unless you interrupt me with questions and want to talk about something else. So feel free to raise your hand at any point. So I think this is a particularly timely topic today. I was just in D.C. on Tuesday at a conference that was put on by the American Enterprise Institute, so a more conservative-leaning think tank. It's also sponsored by Resources for the Future, also sponsored by Brookings Institute. And it was looking at, can carbon tax play a role in fiscal policy, so solving some of the debt issues that we have right now. I think the most noteworthy part of the conversation was the fact that the conversation was taking place and who was actually talking about it. But yesterday, President Obama held a press conference. He was asked about greenhouse gas emissions, climate change. His response was, yes, it's important, but there doesn't seem to be political will in Congress to act on it right now, which says to me, don't expect legislation anytime soon, and probably don't expect the White House to be pushing for legislation anytime soon, so they're not trying to change that political will dynamic right now. That, assume there are other more pressing issues that the White House is dealing with. But President Obama said, expect to hear more from me in the coming months and years about climate change, about addressing greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're not talking about legislative action, then that puts us right back in the field of thinking about the Clean Air Act and how far the EPA can go to address greenhouse gas emissions in a sensible way and in an environmentally responsible way. So, basics for the Clean Air Act. If we care about greenhouse gas emissions in the Clean Air Act, there are two sections of the Clean Air Act that we want to focus on. Again, it's the Clean Air Act is delegation of authority from Congress to EPA. Congress has said what the EPA is supposed to do with the EPA and how the EPA can do it. There are two titles that we really care about the most if we're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions. There's Title I. Title I is focused on, to the left here, Title I, there's a section of Title I that focuses on the concentration of pollution in the atmosphere. This is a picture of smog in LA. So the concentration of pollution in the atmosphere and the concentration that is necessary to protect public health and welfare. So that part of the law isn't focused on necessarily where the pollution is coming from. It's focused on pollution itself. And then there's another section of the law. So this is called, you're going to use the term today, NAAQS, National Ambient Air Quality Standards. The other section of the law that we care about for greenhouse gas emission purposes is called NSPS, New Source Performance Standards, and that part of the law is focused on the source of the pollution. So not worried about the concentration here, but it's focused on standards that apply to where the pollution is coming from. All right, so that's Title I. The next section is Title II. Title II is focused on a different source of pollution. Title II is focused on cars, mobile sources. So this Title II was the subject of litigation that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, Massachusetts EPA and the Supreme Court, which I'll get to in just a minute. In 1970, this is when the Clean Air Act was put in place. There have been some changes to the Clean Air Act since then, but the basic structure for the Clean Air Act remains in place. And in 1970, Congress passed a law that ended up being very resilient to political pressures, resilient to changes in our scientific understanding of the health impacts of pollution, resilient to changes in technology. This is in Title II, again, focused on mobile sources. So this is the EPA's obligation for regulating emissions under Title II. Remember, in 1970, we weren't aware of the impacts of climate change and global warming. So greenhouse gas emissions weren't contemplated when Congress was writing this law. So some of the language here that is relevant, that is part of the story about where we are today. So EPA administrators shall, by regulation prescribed from time to time, revise in accordance with the provisions of this section standards applicable to the emission of any air pollutant from any class or classes of new motor vehicles or new motor vehicle engines, which in this judgment cause or contribute to air pollution, which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. So, important word to jump out: shall prescribe. So it's not discretionary for the EPA administrator's obligation. Emission of any air pollutant. So this doesn't define the air pollutants that Congress was aware of or concerned about in 1970. In his judgment, it's obviously dated that the administrator of the EPA right now is a woman, Lisa Jackson, but in his judgment, so it doesn't require absolute certainty, it requires an informed opinion. Cause or contribute to air pollution, so it doesn't have to be the sole cause, it has to be a contributing factor to the air pollution. And the air pollution must reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. So all those are important triggers. And there's a fair amount of flexibility built into this obligation and change over time. So Massachusetts, the EPA. In the early 2000s, some states and some interest groups were starting to be more vocal, trying to get the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The Bush administration was not particularly enthusiastic about regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, and Massachusetts had specifically petitioned the EPA to take action on greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles, so under Title II, so from mobile sources. And the EPA's response was, we can't. We don't have the authority. We don't believe that greenhouse gas emissions qualify as air pollutant under the Clean Air Act. The Supreme Court looked at the language here, and it said, air pollutant, as defined by the statute, is a direct quote from the Clean Air Act. Air pollutant means any air pollution agent or combination of such agents, including physical, chemical, biological, radioactive substance or matter which is emitted into or otherwise enters the ambient air. So pretty broad definition. Right? So the Supreme Court looked at this definition and said, actually, greenhouse gases do qualify as a pollutant under this definition. The decision of Massachusetts EPA, it didn't say EPA has to regulate. Remember, let's go back a little bit. In order to have an obligation to regulate, not only does it have to be an air pollutant, but it has to cause or contribute to air pollution, which reasonably may be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. So Massachusetts EPA put in place the obligation for the EPA to decide whether this air pollutant endangers public health and welfare. Under the Bush administration, the last couple of years after this decision came out, the Bush administration took a few small steps, didn't issue any regulations. The Obama administration came in and acted pretty quickly. And
what was the original argument on the part of the Bush EPA that they didn't have authority? Did they argue that it wasn't just air pollution, or did they argue that it wasn't air pollution, or did they argue that it wasn't reasonably? Which part of the section were they? So
they made a lot of arguments, but part of the argument was it wasn't an air pollutant, so greenhouse gases were not contemplated under the Clean Air Act to meet the definition of air pollutant. And interpreted some discretion there that the agency had to determine whether or not it was a pollutant. The Supreme Court said, looking at this language, you don't have that discretion. So the Obama administration came in, pretty quickly made two findings. So you've probably heard the term endangerment finding. There's actually two findings. First, they had to decide that greenhouse gases cause or contribute to air pollution, and that air pollution endangers public health and welfare. That sets in motion the obligation for the EPA to regulate it. So they came up with the tailpipe rule. This is the rule that limits greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles. They did this in a way that it was pretty creative. It ended up being not for the scope, the impact of the rule. It ended up being very non-controversial because the auto industry basically was in line with the allocation. They were at the table negotiating when the rule was developed. and talk about why I think that that's particularly interesting and what maybe some lessons could be learned from that going forward during the questions if you all are interested. But the tailpipe rule came out. It's the rule that limits greenhouse gas emissions from tailpipes. At the same time, the Department of Transportation came out with a rule, the exact same time, it came out with a rule that updated the CAFE standards, so the fuel efficiency standards. They did it in a coordinated manner, so even though it was the Department of Transportation rule and an EPA rule, they both required essentially the same thing in practice. So we still got to get from Title II to Title I. All right, so we now know that the EPA is moving on regulating greenhouse gas emissions from tailpipes. We know that today the EPA is also starting to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from stationary sources. So how did that happen? So the way the EPA interprets the Clean Air Act, they believe that the Clean Air Act requires regulation of air pollutants for stationary sources under Title I. Any time that a pollutant is the quote, subject to regulation under the Clean Air Act. So as soon as the EPA started regulating greenhouse gas emissions from tailpipes, that triggered an obligation to also regulate greenhouse gas emissions under Title I. The EPA issued a rule called the timing rule that clarified that and said, as soon as this regulation for tailpipes goes into effect, then the obligation to regulate under Title I also goes into effect. The tailpipe rule went into effect January of 2011. That's the trigger. That's the point at which the EPA also started regulating from stationary sources. Then we had the tailoring rule. This is a Clean Air Act permit requirement. It applies to new facilities that emit large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, so 75,000 tons per year or 100,000 tons per year, depending on type of facility and whether it's new or modified. It was tailored because the Clean Air, generally in the Clean Air Act, where there's a scientific determination, Congress leaves it up to the EPA to make that scientific determination. In the air permitting section of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Air Act is actually explicit and has limits, has the triggers written into the law. Those triggers make sense for pollutants like SO2, NOx, others like that. The EPA looked at that and said, this limit is so low it doesn't make sense for greenhouse gas emissions because 250 tons per year would cover tens of thousands of sources, and we don't want to create that kind of permitting obligation on that large number of sources, because really that's not what we're concerned about for greenhouse gases. We're concerned about the big emitters. So the tailoring rule, the EPA tailored the obligation, tailored the permitting requirements to apply to the biggest entities. So major industrial facilities, fossil fuel-fired power plants.
Quick question, is the timing rule, is that specific to greenhouse gases? And do they do a timing rule whenever this issue comes up, or was this kind of precedent setting for pollutants generally?
It's for pollutants generally. There was some question on what subject to regulation meant. So the EPA defined, or the subject to regulation means the point at which the regulation goes into effect.
And they hadn't had to confront that before?
So there were different opinions that had been offered under the EPA general counsels, but there hasn't been a rule that Jim, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's unusual that you're going to have something starting in Title II and then go over to Title I. It's a pretty new situation.
Yeah, but it's generally not just greenhouse gases. So, not surprisingly, there was a challenge. Wide range of stakeholders brought lawsuits. Some states, some interest groups, some business groups. They were consolidated into generally in one case, Coalition for Responsible Regulation of the EPA. The challenges were to the endangerment finding. I won't go into the details here, but challenges to the endangerment finding, to the tailpipe rule, and to the tailoring rule. The court looked at it and said, the endangerment finding, we think that the way that the EPA approached the endangerment finding was okay. We think that the tailpipe rule is valid exercise of the EPA's authority to follow those two. The tailoring rules, where a lot of people, including myself, thought the EPA was most vulnerable, the court said, you know what, nobody that is suing, nobody's challenging this rule is actually harmed by the tailoring rule. The tailoring rule said, we're limiting the application of this rule to large sources, and we're exempting small sources. So the large sources would have been subject to the rule anyway, and the small sources now are not subject to the rule, so who's harmed by it? So the court didn't reach a decision on the legality of it. tailoring rule. They just said that they don't have, based on who's challenging the rule and why, the court didn't have the authority to make a decision on the tailoring rule at all, which results in the tailoring rule remaining in place. All right, so that's the history. That's how we got to where we are today. And this is where I think it gets a lot more interesting, because in the section of the Clean Air Act that I described before, there's not a whole lot of discretion. The Clean Air Act is more prescriptive in the areas that got us up to where we are today. The new source performance standards section, remember this is the section that deals with the source of pollution, not the concentration of pollution in the air. The source of pollution and stationary sources. The language is quite flexible. Okay, so this is the definition of standard performance. Standard emissions, air pollutants with flexible degree of emission limitation achievable through the application of the best system of emission reduction. Best system, if you look at just the word, system can mean a lot of things. The way that this has been applied historically is it's been applied to the unit level. So at a coal-fired power plant, there may be, say, 6 units, 6 electric generating units. And in SPS, the way it's been applied, it would say, this standard performance applies to every single unit within the power plant. There are a couple of exceptions to that. But best system could potentially be read to mean the entire power plant. Some people have made the argument that best system for greenhouse gas emissions system should be the transmission grid. So how far can we push the definition of the term system? What the EPA has done so far under new source performance standards, in March, the EPA issued a proposed rule. It's not a final rule, it's not an effect, but a proposal. It essentially says that if you're going to build a new fossil fuel-fired power plant, so either a natural gas combined cycle turbine or a coal-fired power plant, that facility has to be as efficient from a greenhouse gas emission perspective as a natural gas combined cycle turbine. So it didn't say that those words, it used a numerical standard, but the numerical standard was set at a level that combined cycle natural gas turbines meet that standard. Coal-fired power plants don't. If you want to build a coal-fired power plant with existing technologies, you basically have to install carbon capture and storage technologies. Same time, the EPA said don't pay too much attention to this. It's not really going to have a major impact because nobody's building new coal-fired power plants anyway. I can see some argument about that. So that's what we are for new source performance standards. There's a proposed rule out there. There have been a lot of comments that were submitted. The EPA has not announced a timeline. We don't know how it may change from the proposed rule to the final rule. What really gets interesting is that there's a section of the Clean Air Act under Section 111, the new source performance standards section. It's a subsection that we affectionately call 111D. This requires the creation of performance standards for existing sources. Okay. Now, when you're building a new facility, you're making a major modification. If you know there's an obligation to control pollution, you can build that into the engineering of the plant. It may be expensive, but if you're doing something anyway, the thought is that dealing with a higher standard makes sense while you're deciding how to proceed. For existing sources, there may be sources that weren't planning on doing anything, but now if you have a new obligation to touch these existing sources, you have older coal-fired power plants that emit a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. You have a new rule that requires some type of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Potentially could be very expensive. And there's a section of the law that has, well, let me go through what triggers Section 111D. So first, the inquiry. Is the pollution covered under NSPS? Here, now greenhouse gases, presumably there will be a final rule for greenhouse gases under NSPS. So yes, the pollutant will be covered under NSPS. And the pollutant is not also regulated as a criteria pollutant or a hazardous air pollutant. So criteria pollutants are the list of 6 pollutants that are covered under the section of law that deals with concentration of pollution in the air in that section. So if it's not a criteria pollutant, which greenhouse gases are not, and it's not a hazardous air pollutant, so think mercury, which greenhouse gases are not. Okay, so we need that. And the existing source would be subject to the NSPS requirement if it were a new or modified source. So here, if it's a natural gas combined cycle turbine, or if it's a coal-fired power plant, then 111D applies. It, potentially can be very impactful. So unlike new sources, where there may be a handful of new sources a year that qualify. Here we've got 665 coal units across the country that qualify. This doesn't include all of the coal units. There are others, but this includes the ones that we think that the rule would apply to. So we don't know what the EPA is thinking here. If it were going to apply a standard on a unit-specific level, like it traditionally has under the New Source Performance Standard section, then maybe it picks an efficiency standard, so heat rate standard. This is just our guess. We were just trying to figure out where the impacts might be. Bottom axis here, we've got heat rate. On the top axis, we've got capacity. You can see that the higher capacity facilities tend to be more efficient. The lower capacity units can be pretty inefficient. So it could potentially have some very broad impacts. And if you have a plant that is far to the right here, the bottom axis, then depending on how the rule is written, you may require you to shut down the plants. It may not be economically viable to do something on any compliance. What this says to us is that because the section of the law is flexible, and because this could have some major environmental impacts, major economic impacts, maybe it makes sense for the EPA for stakeholders to consider how to take advantage of that flexibility and come up with some more creative approaches to regulating greenhouse gases than we've seen in other applications of the Clean Air Act. So why is 111D interesting? One is interesting because of the flexibility here, the second bullet here, the broad language, standard performance, best system. Maybe that can mean something more than unit specific. The first bullet, I think, also makes it interesting. It's not just the EPA that's making the decisions here. Under Section 101D, when you're creating performance standards for existing sources, the EPA sets out guidance. So the EPA says, generally, this is what the requirements are under this section of the law. These are the requirements for the existing sources. The states then take that guidance and figure out how to apply it to the units that are covered within their borders. So not only is there flexibility for the EPA to come up with what the guidance is, there's flexibility for the states to decide how to apply that guidance. Right? So maybe the EPA doesn't issue an opinion about what best system means, but if they leave it up to the states, maybe states think creatively about what best system means. I'll get to that into some options potentially available to the states in the next slide. Almost done here, and then I'll start riffing about my thoughts about where the EPA could go and answer questions. But issues to consider. So the EPA assumes that Gina McCarthy, the Assistant Administrator for Air, has said, they assume every time the EPA issues a regulation, they're going to get sued. So they want to make sure they're on solid legal ground and they're anticipating not going to write a rule. Here, because of broad language, because of limited precedent, it's a lot harder to anticipate what the legal risks are. You can figure out how, you can open up a dictionary and read the definition of system and decide that the definition of system could include the transmission grid, but you don't really know how a court's going to react to the EPA taking such a broad definition, applying some broad definition to the word system in a way that it hasn't done before. So a lot of legal risk. Economic impacts, there's been very little assessment of the cost of these types of rules for existing sources for greenhouse gases in the Clean Air Act, partly because the EPA, I believe, for political purposes, has basically shut the lights off, for the folks who are working on this rule. So there's been, over the past year, almost no work, if any work, at the EPA on the options and potential impacts for designing these existing source performance standards. The role of energy efficiency and renewables is a huge question. New source performance standards, the way that the law is written, it applies to categories of sources. So again, here the category would be natural gas turbines, combined-cycle turbines, and electric generating units at coal-fired plants. A wind farm is not in that category of sources, so the law doesn't apply explicitly to it. But if you have a lot of wind capacity, potentially you can prove that increasing wind capacity decreases the amount of generation from coal-fired power plants. So you could be reducing greenhouse gas emissions by actions that are taking place outside that category of sources. So if you care about greenhouse gas emissions, that's a good thing. If you care about following the letter of the law, it's unclear that the statute allows that kind of action for compliance. Energy efficiency is the same type of consideration. Right? If you're talking about energy efficiency at the consumer level, again, it may reduce the amount of electricity that's being produced at a coal-fired power plant, but the action is taking place outside of the category of sources. And you have to, there has to be some kind of certainty that there's a link between the energy efficiency measures and what's taking place at the power plant or the role of the power plant. So a lot of questions there that smart people are thinking about this, but again, because this is largely uncharted territory, we don't have a lot of answers. So what can the EPA do under Section 111D? First off, the EPA could move forward but be silent, pretty silent. Yep.
So why is this uncharted territory? So if 111D is always triggered by NSPS, and we've had NSPS for a number of years, ordinance, why is this, what's so novel about this that we EPA haven't confronted these issues before?
That's a great question. I should have covered that with a couple slides ago. So almost always when the EPA covers a pollutant under NSPS, it's also regulated under NAAQS or regulated, well, not generally regulated under NAAQS, but it's almost always regulated under hazardous air pollutants. So where 111D is applied, it's been for fluoride emissions. They're not criteria pollutants, not hazardous air pollutants. Sulfuric acid, non-methane emissions from municipal solid waste compressors. So usually that triggers that if it's regulated anywhere else, 111D doesn't apply. Usually that takes it out. So EPA's obligation under 111D, it has to create guidance. And that guidance can be specific, or potentially the guidance could be general. States create existing source performance standards. Generally, need to achieve some measurable emission reductions, figure out how to do it. Or it could be, somewhat explicit, where it says, here's the number, here's the greenhouse gas emission number, maybe it's a heat rate efficiency number, something like that. States go and figure out how to apply this. Could be vocal, or EPA could be silent on whether energy efficiency, renewable energy count, but again, that could have a lot to do with the choices that the government entities make, where the investments go, how expensive or inexpensive it is to comply with the law. Could that system mean company-wide averaging? So maybe Duke Energy complies with a standard across all of the units that Duke Energy owns. Some presumably would be are more efficient than others. Maybe it's cheaper to make some upgrades, efficiency upgrades in some plants than others. Statewide averaging, since it's the states that come up with the plan, maybe North Carolina could say all the units within our state have to meet the heat rate standard. Is interstate cooperation allowed? Potentially. There's nothing specifically in the language of the statute that says no. The EPA tried, when it was regulating, its first attempt at regulating mercury emissions under the Bush administration, the Clean Air Mercury Rule, created a trading program under Section 111, and 111D was triggered there. That law was, but the regulation was overturned for reasons that are not related to 111D, but that never went into effect. But potentially interstate cooperation is allowed in some of the charts here. We also had others that my colleague John Gomes put together that looks at the regional impacts. So where the units are that would be out of compliance with an 87% standard, for example, it differs by region. So interstate cooperation could allow some of the regions where it would be more expensive to comply to cooperate with regions that would be less expensive to comply. Markets, California and Reggie already have carbon markets in place. And there's some interest there in saying, what we're already doing should count as compliance under this new obligation under the Clean Air Act. Query whether the best system includes a market. So this is where we are. And as I understand it, there are a number of environmental groups right now that this is where they want to see the Obama administration push, is on the regulation of existing sources. This is where there's clear statutory authority to do something. There's already momentum here. It doesn't require congressional action. Potentially Congress could overturn the EPA's authority, but given the dynamics in the House and the Senate after the election, that's not likely to happen. So something's going to happen here, and creativity under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act could impact the costs and could impact the environmental benefits that we achieve from the rule. So we at the Nicholas Institute have been doing a fair amount of work here, working with stakeholders and some legal analysis to try to figure out what the bounds of legal risk are. I'm happy to go into that in more detail if that would be at all interesting to folks in the audience. But at this point, happy to answer questions if there are.
So on that graph that you showed with the power plants, the smallest ones were the least efficient. If you set that standard where the line was, would you be effectively reducing a lot of emissions? I mean, because the bigger power plants are presumably emitting more emissions than the small ones. Are you still cutting CO2 emissions significantly, or is it going to be not sufficient or not as effective?
Great question. I'm going to answer like a good lawyer and say it depends. It depends on how the rule is written. If it's written as an efficiency standard, then you could comply with the law of becoming more efficient, but you could also run the plant more, and therefore you're emitting greenhouse gas emissions, emitting more greenhouse gas emissions. So not necessarily. That's part of the idea of paying attention to the flexibility. It's not just paying attention to where you get the cost benefits, but paying attention to where you may be able to get more greenhouse gas emissions for less cost. But it depends on where the EPA sets the number. It also depends on how they set the number. It depends on whether there's flexibility built into it. And it also depends on factors that are outside of the Clean Air Act, right? I mean, we've been arguing for years about a cap and trade system, and then as a result of the economic downturn and natural gas prices being a lot lower than we had anticipated, we're below what we thought we would be at this point for greenhouse gas emissions, and have really very little to do with law. I wish we could talk to that a lot more than I could. So it depends on a lot of factors.
I'm just wondering, so for industries outside of the power sector, I mean, what do you think they should anticipate? I mean, like steel comes to mind. Like a large consumer of coal. Do you think that they would be? I mean, do you think that they would be exempt from this because of an economic consideration, or what do you think would happen with those industries?
So there are already the air permitting requirements that I talked about, the tailoring rule. They're already subject to that if they meet the threshold, but if they hit over 75,000 or 100,000 tons per year. Okay, that's a permitting requirement. There's a technology mandate that goes along with that requirement to solve the best available technology, best available control technology, but there's some flexibility in what that means for you. For resource performance standards, NSPS is designed to apply to categories of sources. That's why I've been emphasizing what it applies to here. For 111D, for the greenhouse gas rule under resource performance standards, the category is defined as combined cycle turbines and electric generating units and coal power plants. The EPA issued in the consent decree, part of why the EPA released this resource performance standards for greenhouse gases for power plants is because it entered into a consent decree at the end of 2010 with environmental groups that it sued because the EPA had not included greenhouse gas emissions in the resource performance standards the last time they updated the SPS for power plants and for refineries. So the consent decree, the EPA agreed to come out with performance standards for power plants, which they've now proposed a rule, and for refineries, which they haven't taken any action on at all. And the NSPS rule for cement that was issued a couple of years ago, the EPA acknowledged that they were explicitly not addressing greenhouse gas emissions in that rule, but said we may revisit that decision in the future. I haven't heard any discussion about performance standards for steel plants and other industrial facilities, but potentially, this part of what I want you all to take away from this talk is that now there's a process in place that gives the EPA a lot less discretion now about whether to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. There's still discretion about how to regulate, but there's less discretion about whether to regulate. So next time they're considering performance standards, they may have a hard time not including greenhouse gases for all these other sectors.
I'm trying to understand the renewable energy component that you kind of have in there. So if the NSPS are set for the category of electric generating units at a level that coal can't meet without CCS, then how would the existence of renewable energy, even within the same company, how would that impact, how would that make it so that they're not violating that
So that's where it matters a lot when you're talking about a new source or when you're talking about an existing source. If you're a new source, if you're going to build a new coal-fired power plant, the rule EPA proposed goes into effect, then renewables have nothing to do with it. It really is focused on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of electricity from what you're building. If you're talking about existing sources, what I'm suggesting is if you read system broadly, you define the term system broadly, then it could mean that you're looking at impacts in the electricity sector that are reducing greenhouse gas emissions broadly, whether or not the action is taking place in that specific unit or not.
I just had a question about the market issue. I know that they had to make a new title for sulfur dioxide or acid rain trading program, and so I wonder what are the legal, how much legal capacity is there for a market if we had to make a new title for acid rain? Why don't we have to do that for carbon?
So, I might actually turn to Jim on this one, but arguably they didn't have to come up with a new title. By coming up with a new title, they created a clear, explicit authority for the EPA to act, and for sulfur dioxide emissions or nitrous oxide emissions, they created a system for the EPA to move forward. I don't know whether they could create a market under action or
It's a
not.
very good question, if you're paying attention. It's complicated because so the Title IV comes out in 1990 amendments. There's a lawsuit that's decided later, the CARE, which basically says there's no trading to create a hotspot. So unless there were a title for sulfur dioxide would have been in trouble as well. The reason it's probably not an issue for greenhouse gases is you can't get a hotspot with greenhouse gases. It's a different kind of beast. And so the CARE vote is not going to happen. But President Obama's press conference yesterday is moved anyway because they're not going to say it's a no nuclear.
Right. So interstate trading, intrastate trading, presumably could have been allowed under even without the acid rain trading program. The interstate trading and removing a lot of the legal risk with the EPA was important. That's part of the acid rain trading. But here, that was also under a separate section of the law. So here, under NSPS, again, it depends on the definition of the language. So we know that the definition could reasonably be read broadly. It hasn't been, at least put the camera roll aside because that was struck down for other reasons. It hasn't been read as broadly as I'm suggesting that potentially it could.
On camera, so camera, maybe remind us about what happened with that, where EPA was trying to go with that. So they were trying to do mercury under 111, is that right? And the decision was made that they couldn't do it there, they needed to do it under the air toxics part. So that basically, the Supreme Court said, when you have this branching tree structure up here, whether you go down the 111 route or the air toxic route, you guys went down the wrong one.
Yeah.
When EPA was developing camera, though, under 111, they must have confronted a lot of the issues that you're confronting now with greenhouse gases. Like, what is the definition of a system? I'm guessing maybe they made some arguments that, in that case, the best system was a trading system. So could you say something about whether the way EPA went under camera gives any insight into the way that they could go with greenhouse gases under 111? Or maybe there's no analogy.
No, there's absolutely an analogy. I think the farthest you can go using camera is you can say there were very good arguments put out by the EPA to justify why a market system was allowed under 111D. There were also credible arguments that were put out under the challenges that was fully briefed before the court. The court just never reached a decision, so we don't know where the court, if the court had gotten to that point, we don't know where it would come out. But the EPA did say that's partly a schizophrenic justification, but for our purposes here, the EPA did say best system can mean a broad application across the system of coal-fired power plants. And the EPA under camera also did something that I don't think the EPA will do here for greenhouse gases, but the EPA removed some of the risk for trading by saying, states, you have an obligation to regulate mercury emissions for existing sources. If you want to do a trading program, a national trading program, here's how you can do it. The EPA was very explicit about what a national trading program would look like. They wrote it out so the states could just opt into it. So from the legal risk perspective, you don't know what the court would have said to look at that. You do know that if a state opted into it, then the EPA would have approved it. And that's one of the big questions here is whether politically the EPA can provide that kind of certainty to the states. If you want to take advantage of flexibility, be it renewable energy, be it energy efficiency, be it markets, if it looks like this, then we'll approve it. We'll say it's okay. Prior to the election, the EPA was of the mindset that it didn't want to look at all like it was endorsing a cap and trade program. It was trying to go back to a program to do what Congress couldn't do. That's what the two politically dicey. Maybe the political dynamic has changed now. They provide a little more certainty. It's a lot like, does that help me? There's a lot more I can say. Sure.
I was wondering if you're aware of any analyses that have been done projecting potential costs on the sort of per unit of CO2 reduction, or are there just too many uncertainties out there to even do that type of analysis?
So emission reductions under the Clean Air Act specifically.
Yeah, or under the new source rule or the existing rule, or just any aspect of this project.
So there's some. The difficult part about it is there's so many options that for the EPA to move forward that to do the modeling you have to make some pretty general assumptions which may not end up being true. Dallas Birchall and RFF has done some of the first work on this and has a publication on it. Very good work. His starting point was if you have a percentage reduction across the board for greenhouse gas emissions, that was the requirement, and then looking at how that impact, how that played out from a cost perspective, and also how it played out from a regional perspective. And the result is, flexibility for meeting the standard matters a lot to the cost, not surprisingly, and potentially much bigger impacts in some parts of the country than others, also not surprising. My colleague Eitan Government stole his figures from some modeling that he's also doing, where his starting point is a different starting point. His starting point is if the EPA is going to come up with an efficiency standard, here we put 87%, but that's kind of random. But if the EPA starts off with an efficiency standard and says the emission reductions that we think we could achieve under this broadly applied efficiency standard, we think we can get this level of emission reductions. States, your guidance is to figure out how you're going to achieve the equivalent number of reductions, regardless of how to do it. So that's how the EPA would determine whether or not the state's plan is appropriate or not, is if it achieved an equivalent number of, or equivalent level of reductions. It's an educated guess as we can make at the time about what was politically viable, but again, it's just a guess. So the general modeling has been done by a small number of people. I think that the lessons that seem to be consistent with the little amount of modeling that I've seen are, again, flexibility impacts cost. Regional electricity mixes obviously have an age of plants in different regions have a lot to do with the local impacts. But it's hard to gain many more lessons out of it.
The thing that I would imagine would be incredibly difficult particularly for existing sources, is where do you draw the line? What line do you draw?
Right.
It's not like you're gonna, for some pollutants you might argue if there's a threshold effect, or if we got it down to this level, we could solve the problem. They're not going to be able to actually do that, right? Because if you actually tie the emission reduction to climate change, it's entering into a global mix, and so where they pretty hard conundrum that they would be facing when they kind of draw that line.
And Richard actually hit at another conundrum that I didn't highlight, but I can continue this that informed the decisions that the EPA made. When I showed the first slide about Title I, where you've got the max, the concentration of pollution, or you've got an SPS, the sources of pollution. The EPA, the same language under Title II that says EPA, if it endangers public health and welfare and causes injury, the same language is basically in Title II as it is in Title I for deciding whether or not to regulate under the max section of worry about the concentration of pollution. EPA, it's hard to justify this if it were challenged, but it hasn't been challenged in this decision. The EPA has not made the same determination under Title I that it did in Title II, because if it did, then it would require regulating under the maybe air quality section of the Act, which would mean that EPA would have to set a level that it determines is adequate to protect public health and welfare. Where the EPA set that number either means the entire country is in attainment in compliance with the standard, or the entire country is out of compliance with the standard. And there's really nothing that any individual state can do to bring itself back into compliance. EPA is, because of the way that section of the statute is set up, EPA doesn't want to touch it for greenhouse gases. And so far, it hasn't been challenged. The Center for Biological Diversity petitioned the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under that section, but the EPA hasn't responded to that petition. And when EPA does something, then it's subject to a lawsuit. When EPA doesn't do something, then it's much harder to challenge EPA for having not made a decision than challenging it based on the decision that they made. Good.
This is kind of building off of that. Do you think that regulation under the Clean Air Act is actually going to be sufficient to solve the problem of greenhouse gas emissions, or is it just a stopgap? It's either one of those, or the risks of relying on the EPA to use the law in that way instead of coming up with a new legislative solution.
Yeah. So there are a lot of ways to answer that question. I'll say, first off, the EPA was, in 2008, 2009, 2010, making the argument to Congress, we don't even think regulating greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act is the best way to go. We think that legislation is better. But from a practical perspective, the Clean Air Act is the tool that's available. And we don't have to solve this problem right away, but it's a process. The Clean Air Act is putting a process in place. If the Clean Air Act, if the Section 111D regulations are written in a way that encourages states to experiment, encourages states to take advantage of flexibility, encourages states to be laboratories of democracy, then maybe that sets a process in place where the ideas bubble back up and it comes back up to the federal level, and then the federal government takes a more comprehensive look at the problem. I think based on the language of the Clean Air Act, or that I described, it requires a consideration of cost. So the EPA is going to require something under the new source performance standard section or the existing source performance standard section, that it has to consider the cost impacts, which means that limits what the rule could do. It also, there's a political level of this, and politics are somewhat limited. Even if the EPA had very broad authority and wanted to act very aggressively, politics may limit it. So I think that in the short term, if what you're concerned about is a large percentage of greenhouse gas emission reduction, in the near term, Clean Air Act is probably not going to get there. You could be setting a process in place to get to more effective emission reductions like that one. That's why I think that the initial design here matters a lot.
To what extent, so the federal government now has a set of social cost of carbon numbers. There's one central one, and there's like a range, 5 of them, which is now being used in regulatory impact proceedings. So, to what extent do you think that EPA, under development of under 111D, would either be able to or have to develop those regulations with an eye toward that social cost of carbon? So the midpoint there is like $20 per ton, right? So whereas when we think about cap and trade, that could be approached from some kind of a quantitative reduction market. There is in fact a dollar per ton number that EPA could reference, and maybe should reference at this point, in terms of setting a target for under 111D. Does that make sense? So you could, the way you decide how, to what extent to regulate is, you do it until the marginal cost is $20 per ton.
So
has that come up? Have you heard anybody talking about that?
Well, so you asked it 2 ways. One, could the EPA and plus the EPA, right? Could the EPA, I think from a legal perspective, yes. I think the EPA could take that social cost of carbon into account. Does it have to? I don't think that it does. And especially in this circumstance, because the EPA's role is really to start the process and leave it to the states. And you may have different states taking a different perspective on what cost means to them. But yeah, I think that would be a hard lawsuit to win to say that the EPA has to do that.
Yeah, I was wondering if you, I see all the flexibility that they have moving forward, and there's a lot of question about what direction they're going to take. But can you speculate a little bit whether you think they're going to go to the union level, regulate on a sort of company-wide basis, state, leave up to states? How are they going to, you have an opinion on how they're going to go? Or how they should go?
Well, that's harder for me to answer than you have an opinion about where they. So I think that the folks writing the rule of the EPA are very aware that of the cost benefits and potential emission reduction benefits of flexibility. They haven't told me what they're going to do, but having talked with some of the people, they take the obligation to address environmental issues seriously, and they want to use this as effectively as possible. I think that the more that the EPA can do to endorse creativity at the state level, or endorse experiments that states have already taken. So Reggie, Clean Air Act provided incentive for other states that haven't considered market-based programs to opt into something like Reggie or a California type market, and maybe reinvigorate some of the interest in the Western Climate Initiative. We had a lot of states that were first considering it and stepped away. This, depending on how it's written, it could be like that into that. I think in the short term, even though President Obama was reelected, and even though there's a little bit more of a push for the Democrats in the Senate right now, I think it's still a highly partisan issue, and the cost impacts are potentially very high. So I think that the EPA probably has not a whole lot of wiggle room for being creative with this.
Another question. You mentioned at the beginning about the tailpipe rule, and it went very smoothly. Like, did you want to expand upon that? Was there was it the bailout that caused it? I mean, why?
Yes, there were a lot of interesting factors that came into play there. You had the EPA and the Obama administration that were essentially saying, they're making the argument, we don't have a choice now, we have to regulate greenhouse gases from renewable sources. So this is going to happen one way or the other, you can be at the table or not. So that was one argument. Another argument is, just historically, the way the Clean Air Act was written in 1970, it allowed California for emission from motor vehicles to go farther than the EPA's regulations. So the compromise was California already had regulations in place when the Clean Air Act was written in 1970. And part of the political compromise was to let California still experiment. But also part of the compromise was we don't want 50 different air standards for mobile sources. So at most, we can have 2 standards for mobile sources. We can have the California standard, and if other states want to follow the California standard, they can, or you can have an EPA standard. So at most, you could have 2 standards for air pollution, assuming that California has permission to go back to petition the EPA to be more creative, and the EPA has to say yes. And the Bush administration, the EPA said no. In this instance, California, you can't go farther than the EPA has gone for greenhouse gas emissions from tailpipes. The Obama administration overturned that and said yes, California, you can. So suddenly now auto manufacturers in the U.S. had the prospect of a California standard and another standard, and didn't want to have to deal with that. So that was another motivating factor to get together and work on. So California was at the table, auto manufacturers at the table. At the time when the U.S. government was investing heavily in the auto bailout, so there was a lot less ability for the auto manufacturers to play political hardball anyway. So they were at the table. Environmental groups were at the table. Unions were at the table. And I think, very wisely, the White House made sure that the Department of Transportation and the EPA were at the table, because they could have had competing rules there under the CAFE standards and under the greenhouse gas rules. So they made sure that it was coordinated. And as a result, broadly, the interest groups that would have challenged us from one side or the other had already agreed that this is probably something that's a good idea. So we ended up getting a radical increase in fuel economy standards, it's been fairly flat for decades, so a radical increase, and really not a whole lot of commentary around it. The folks that were challenging the tailpipe rule in the lawsuit that I mentioned were not the auto manufacturers. There were other interest groups, and the reason they were challenging it was because that's the hook for EPA to start regulating stationary sources. So they were trying to overturn the tailpipe rule because if the EPA is not appropriately regulating greenhouse gas emissions from tailpipes, then the EPA, under this process, could not then regulate stationary sources. So that's why they cared. So it wasn't even the covered entities in the tailpipe rule that were suing. I mean, say that consumers are affected by the tailpipe rule, but it wasn't the auto manufacturers that were suing. So interesting to think about whether there are lessons to be learned there to apply to stationary sources. Maybe you look at it and say, this set of circumstances was so unique that it doesn't really, there aren't lessons to learn for stationary sources. Maybe you look at that and you say, it's one thing to get a very small number of auto manufacturers in the room together. If you're talking about large stationary sources of greenhouse gas emissions, that tentacles can stretch into the entire economy of the U.S. There's not a table that big to get that many stakeholders together to agree. The impacts of rules on stationary sources potentially greater for auto manufacturers. It only is dealing with new cars, so they can incorporate these requirements into the manufacturing process. If it's existing power plants, that's a very different equation. So, but you could also look at it and you could say, there may be different reasons that people come to the table, but the EPA is regulating their greenhouse gases. There are going to be entities that are affected by it. And the EPA is moving forward on its own right now. Perhaps there's a reason to get together and bring folks to the table. Maybe this fiscal debate, addressing environmental policy and fiscal policy through the same tool. So pricing carbon and raising revenue for the federal government. Maybe that's a way to bring strange bedfellows to the table together and start talking about this. So it depends on what you look at. I think it's worth paying attention to figure out what lessons can be learned from the whole process.
Yeah, when you find out the bedfellow, Bobby was taught at a seminar course here last semester. He was sort of pitching his idea of having a carbon tax that would be tied to revenue reduction. I mean, do you think that that's something that has, maybe not his idea specifically, but that idea in general, do you think that that could gain traction?
It's gotten a lot more attention than I would have expected it to. Bobby comes across as the happy warrior who's who's kind of engaging just because he believes that it's important. But for a while when he first started talking about it, what getting a lot of attention from the core constituency who the Republican Party would have to pay attention to. At this American Enterprise Institute conference on Tuesday, there were folks that were in the room. We don't pay attention to environmental policy at all. We pay attention to fiscal policy. We're starting to have a conversation about if we have to raise revenue, then maybe we want to raise it by taxing something bad, carbon tax, rather than taxing something good, income. Maybe there's going to be a fiscal cliff debate, and there's going to be something that's probably decided pretty soon, and then which is not going to solve the long-term problem. There's going to have to be some kind of grand bargain at some point, and maybe carbon taxes, maybe that raise like carbon taxes. I don't know. It's interesting to think about if you're looking at a carbon tax as a way to generate revenue, then what you think is the right price could be very, very different than if you're looking at a carbon tax because you want to reduce emissions. So if you're arguing for just two policies, there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, if you want to hold revenue constant, you have to constantly increase the price of carbon because you talk about the reduction.
Yeah. Actually, somebody from Heritage Institute asked one of the panelists on Tuesday, is a carbon tax a schizophrenic tax? Because by taxing it, you're going to presumably lead to fewer carbon emissions. So if you're really successful, then you reduce the allocation completely, and you don't have to tax anymore. So how do you replace that later? The answer is maybe you don't have to. If the carbon tax is going up, so it's still using carbon somewhere. A year ago, I wouldn't have guessed that carbon tax would be taken as seriously as it is right now. Major caveat: I don't think that it should be taken that seriously, but when you have folks in the room on Tuesday at DC that talking about it in a serious way, I think that's a good sign. And by the way, those
join me in thanking Jonas for the presentation.